All right, good evening, everyone. This event will be available in Spanish translation.
Buenas noches a todos. Si necesitan una traducción en español, por favor mire su pantalla y verán un botón que está por debajo de la palabra, interpretación, verán la imagen de un globo y haga clic sobre el globo y después verá la opción de hacer clic sobre la versión español. ¿Alguna persona que necesita interpretación en este momento? Alce la mano. Okay, I've given the instruction.
Thank you. Welcome to tonight's event hosted by the U.S. Department of Justice in the city of Springfield. Tonight, we will hear from the finalists for the compliance evaluator position with the city of Springfield. Tonight's agenda will be as follows. We'll have a welcome from the co-moderators. We'll then have opening remarks from the U.S. Attorney, Rachel Rollins, and the City Solicitor, John Payne. We'll also have an overview of the purpose of tonight's meeting. And we'll have introductions from finalist teams. We'll also review ground rules and then go over the questions and answers. We'll then have closing remarks from the finalists, and then conclusion and discussion, as well as next steps. Just a reminder to please select English if you want to stay in the English interpretation of this event. To do so, there's a globe at the bottom of your screen, and you will click on that and then click English. So again, you'll click on the globe at the bottom of your screen, which is next to the record button. Then there will be three options: original audio, English, or Spanish, and you will click the option for English.
Thank you for getting us started, Talia. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jennifer Serafin. I am Chief of the Civil Rights Unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and just wanted to make sure, just so everyone's clear, when we say DOJ or Department of Justice, it includes both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the larger Department of Justice, which people think of as being based in DC, which it is, but just wanted to remind people that the U.S. Attorney's Office is a part of the Department of Justice. And I'll turn it over to Talia.
Thank you. And excuse me, my name is Talia G. I am First Associate City Solicitor for the City of Springfield, and I work in the City of Springfield Law Department.
Great. So now I'd like to turn it over to our U.S. Attorney, Rachel Rollins, who is the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, and she'll just give some brief opening remarks. Rachel?
Yes, thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm Rachel, the U.S. Attorney, and I promise I will not be long, but I did want to say that I think this forum reflects one of our many efforts to be transparent as the federal government with community about our implementation after a years-long investigation into the Springfield Police Department of a settlement agreement. The compliance evaluator, which we're going to be talking about tonight, or interviewing some individuals or groups regarding tonight, is someone who will be interacting with the community. And it was important, really important for us to create a space for the community to meet the finalists. I want to say that, you know, we are moving forward, but we have to acknowledge the harm that happened to get us here. And when communities don't trust law enforcement, nobody's safe. Crime increases, violent and serious crimes end up going unsolved, and the community becomes resentful because it's our tax dollars that pay for the police. And if we feel as if we can't trust them or call them, nobody is safe, and it's not a positive outcome. We have made certain determinations. We are moving forward, I hope, on a positive path, but we do have to acknowledge that the community in Springfield is tired and has felt as if they were not heard for quite some time. We are going to be actively involved, as you've seen with Michelle and Jennifer, showing up frequently in Springfield. I've only been U.S. Attorney for 7 months, I've been to Springfield multiple times. I will be back out in Springfield on July 28th for a Project Safe Neighborhood meeting. And I'm hoping that I get to meet the community as well as law enforcement when I'm out there. But I want to thank you guys for your interest. I think we have a great, over 50 people are attending, and I'm excited about the interest we have and the hard work we have moving forward. But my hope is that it's going to be positive. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, U.S. Attorney Rollins. And now I will introduce Judge John Payne, who's the city solicitor for the city of Springfield.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is John Payne. I am the city solicitor, and I'm here tonight representing Mayor Dominic Sarno, who is away, and I'm also representing Superintendent Cheryl Clapper. We are pleased that we are having the citizen involvement here tonight as an assistance in the selection of the compliance evaluator who will be dealing with this settlement agreement that was negotiated between the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the city of Springfield, and has now become a federal order. I know that Mayor Sarno would want to thank the U.S. Attorney Rachel Rollins for her involvement and the relationship that she has established here with him and the city administration. We would also like to thank her attorneys, the U.S. attorneys who have worked diligently with us, along with the attorneys from the Department of Justice, who have worked in a cooperative manner with the Springfield Police Department, with the City Law Department, and the Sarno administration. I would indicate that there are a number of initiatives that are going to be undertaken here with respect to this. But I would also note that under the leadership of the Superintendent Clapper, a number of these initiatives have already been enacted or are being enacted. And I would give a simple example that the Springfield Police have been using body-worn cameras now for more than 2 years. And the Springfield Police Department was the first police department in the Commonwealth in which all members of the Springfield Police Department were wearing body-worn cameras. We hope that those who are attending here tonight, those citizens who have participated by submitting questions that will be posed to the candidates and who are watching this event here tonight, will continue their involvement, will take the time to meet with the compliance evaluator, whoever is selected, when they have their meetings with the public. And we look forward to their continued involvement as this agreement is implemented in the weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge Payne. We'll likely build in some pauses just so that our wonderful interpreter can catch a breath every now and again. I'm going to just go over the purpose of tonight's meeting just to make sure everyone's on the same page. The purpose of everyone gathering here tonight, and thanks again to the well over 50 community members who are in attendance, is to give you all, the community, an opportunity to meet the finalists, to learn about their qualifications for the compliance evaluator position, to hear how they'll perform their duties equitably to help ensure police reform in Springfield, and to just get a sense of what their approach will be through this process. We realize how important it is for the public to have confidence in the party's compliance evaluator choice. And when I say the parties here, I mean, the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office on one hand, and the City of Springfield and the Police Department on the other. They are the entities that will be selecting the compliance evaluator. But we're here because we all agree that community input is important. And that's why we've included the community in the selection process as much as we can. There were multiple applicants. We have interviewed those applicants and as a group decided on these 2 teams as the finalists. And now it's the opportunity for the community to sort of hear their responses to the questions that you've all submitted ahead of time. Thank you again for submitting those terrific questions. And now we'll proceed with sort of what you're all here for, which is hearing from both teams. So I'll introduce both teams and just give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves. and then we'll get into some questions. So again, we have two teams. The first team is made up of Kathleen O'Toole, Rodney Monroe, and Natalia Delgado. And then the second team is Andrew Law and Perry Tarrant. And so what we'll do is we'll just give each team about a few minutes to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some questions. So let's start with the team of O'Toole, Monroe, and Delgado.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. And just let me say that we really appreciate this opportunity to engage with all of you. We understand the value of community input and feedback, and really appreciate this opportunity. Our bios are readily available online. Well, I don't think we need to reiterate all of our decades of experience. We want to take these few minutes to underscore how passionate and how sincere we are about our work. The Springfield Police Department will only succeed if it earns and maintains the trust of the community. And we'll work hard as honest brokers to help build and maintain bridges between the police, the other parties in this consent decree, and also the community. We have no agendas but to get it right, to assist the parties and the community as you work hard to address the concerns that have been identified. I'd like Rodney and Natalia to say hello too. I'm very excited about the prospect of working with both of them on this project. Rodney?
Thank you, Kathy. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rodney Monroe. I've been in law enforcement a little over 40 years. Started my career in Washington, D.C. I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to serve citizens in 4 different cities. 3 of them as chief of police: Macon, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of the things that I would emphasize is that in each one of those assignments, I've had the opportunity to really put forth great efforts in engaging the community, because I truly believe that the community is a part of the police department. Everything we do, every community that we're in, residents, citizens, visitors are there, and it's our responsibility to make sure that they are inclusive in what we do. Thank you.
Natalia?
Thank you. My name is Natalia Delgado. I am an attorney licensed in Illinois. I was born and raised on the southwest side of Chicago, and I've spent the majority of my career working in public service in state, county, and city governments. I've been usually supervising teams of litigators, and in every role I've been intentional about the role of directly impacted people in achieving solutions. So I am extremely grateful for the opportunity to hear from and take questions from the community, and look forward to responding to how our team can assist in achieving compliance.
Thanks, Natalia. I'm particularly excited about this opportunity as a Massachusetts native. I served as Boston Police Commissioner for a while and as Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts, as well as Chief of Police out in Seattle. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity to meet many of you in person during this process. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll hear introductions from the Law Tarrant team.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Law, and I'm here with my partner, Perry Tarrant. And we're so excited to be here and really eager to jump into the work that's so important for this city and this community if given the opportunity. By way of background, we offer a diverse perspective on the critical issues that pertain to the settlement agreement and the lived experiences of community members in Springfield. My background is that of a lawyer. I've been a civil rights lawyer, I've been a civilian oversight investigator, and I was the managing prosecutor of a unit that addresses officer-involved uses of force. Mr. Tarrant, and you'll hear from him directly in a moment, he was a former assistant chief in the Seattle Police Department who has worked on a number of DOJ monitoring projects and has worked with communities in some of the most difficult moments following some of the most impactful police use of force incidents in the country. And that includes in Ferguson, Missouri, in Oakland, California, following the shooting of Oscar Grant, and in Charlotte, North Carolina, when Walter Scott lost his life as a result of an officer-involved shooting that was prosecuted. We are thrilled to be here, as I indicated, and we are a small team. That Mr. Tarrant and I will make this project our professional focus, and I will turn it over to Perry so he can introduce himself.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, Springfield. I'll be brief. I'll be very brief. And again, getting into law enforcement was never my train of thought. I got into law enforcement after a negative experience, negative contact with the police. And the only way to change that system is up close and personal, which has been my passion throughout my near 4 decades in law enforcement. We're happy and excited for this opportunity. Again, like I said, the partnership does not happen without being up close and personal, and that's absolutely what you can count on from us. I've had the opportunity and was asked by not only members of Congress, but also by the White House to lead their blue ribbon team into a number of different communities immediately following police and community member shootings and the critical follow-up that happens after that. Again, a lot of expertise on the operational side, but more importantly, and my focus has always been making the police part of the community. And I will turn it back over to the moderator.
Thank you both finalist teams for those introductions. Next, I'll go over the ground rules for tonight's event. Each finalist team will be asked 9 questions. I know that it says 5, but because of the number of questions that we received, each team will actually be asked 9 questions in total. All teams will receive the same questions and will answer them in alternating order. Finalist teams will have 2.5 minutes total to answer each question. At the 2-minute mark, I will put in the chat that they only have 30 seconds left. And so they'll need to wrap up the answer to their questions. Just again, keep in mind that I know that the teams consists of multiple people. And so each team only has 2.5 minutes to answer. Please mute your microphones when you are not speaking so that we can be respectful of everyone. And also, I would just ask that you speak slowly and pause if you can. I know you only have 2.5 minutes, but pause if you can so that we can allow for proper interpretation. And we will start with asking we'll start with the questions and answers, and we will direct the first question to Andrew Lott and Perry Terrence's team. And they'll answer the question first, and then Kathleen O'Toole and her team will answer second. So the first question is, how will you engage the public, accept feedback from the community, and work to resolve specific issues identified in the consent decree?
Perry, I'll start and turn it over to you. Well, the first thing we would do is get on the ground in Springfield. If we were selected as compliance evaluator, you can't do this work without engaging folks, not just in one place, but where folks live, where they go, where they worship, and understanding, hearing what the impacts have been in this city. We can read about it, but until you are with people and hearing about the lived experiences, you don't really capture the full essence of what's happening. And we know that just based on the research that we've done, that there's a great deal of trauma that's happened in this community. And as the Department of Justice has found, significant issues with respect to uses of force. So that would be the first step that we would do. And of course, we would engage further, as Perry will point out.
And again, thank you for the opportunity. The first thing we would do is listen. The bottom line in every community that I've had the opportunity to respond to, the first piece of that is your voice. You are the most critical component of this. In every community, every single response, the first thing I start with are a series of listening sessions to get to know the folks in the community and to hear your voice and what matters to you. The second part of that is listening to the youth voice. In every community I participated in, the youth have been a critical component in participating in that initial assessment. And then the last piece of that is bringing everybody together to put together a plan that mutually benefits everyone involved. And that's how you get to community. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. And now we'll turn it over to Kathleen O'Toole and her team.
Thank you. There's nothing more important than community engagement in this process. I've seen consent decrees from several perspectives. I've been an expert for the US DOJ on consent decrees and investigations in the past. I was actually the monitor of a consent decree in Connecticut, and I was the chief in Seattle under a consent decree. So I've seen what works and what doesn't work. Being a Massachusetts resident, a lifelong Massachusetts resident, I'm available to spend lots of time on the ground in Springfield, roll up my sleeves, meet people, engage authentically, and listen carefully to their perspectives. I've found that the only process that works is a collaborative process, and I would agree that listening is the most important piece of that. Rodney, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Kathy, I would just add again, the importance of the community's voice. And when you start looking at how it relates to the consent decree, the community needs to be fully aware of what the consent decree contains and look at it from the perspective of how it affects them. What outcomes do they want to see as it relates from the consent decree? Yes, as experts, we have our own ideas based on our experience in administering consent decrees and how these things came together. But I think the important aspect of it is for how does the community see it? What do they want out of it? And quite naturally, it's going to involve reaching every corner of Springfield in order to get that feedback from them.
Natalia, did you have anything to add?
Well, one more point concretely, I think also doing intelligent things like making sure that you're identifying ways that the community can engage in ways that they can speak freely and safely. So making sure that we are de-identifying the information that we're collecting so that people don't feel that there could be consequences from their participation. So to add to the big picture, also we have super specific and concrete ideas about how we move this work forward.
Thank you. So for the second question, now we'll reverse the order. So we'll start with the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team for this question. Please describe how your organization will investigate and resolve potential compliance issues.
In my experience, this really has to be a collaborative effort, working in mutual respect. Now, collaborative doesn't necessarily mean we'll always agree. I know in Seattle and East Haven, Connecticut, other places where I've worked on consent decrees, we have some very spirited discussions, spirited debates. But we look at the data. We have to compile information that's accurate. We have to listen carefully to the community. And then we sit down respectfully and try to reconcile the differences. Now, at the end of the day, it's up to the monitoring team to call balls and strikes and to provide some guidance to the parties. We want to see everybody succeed. We want to work in collective purpose here to see this as success for the police department and a success for the community it serves. Natalia, anything you'd like to add?
I think one of the points you started with, which is being honest brokers here. So because we don't have an agenda, we would be coming in and investigating things from a point of not having an agenda and actually trying to get to solutions and meaningful solutions that would be long-term solutions, not just band-aids for what we have happening at the moment.
It can't just be a check the box. I think that for each paragraph within the consent decree, they need to have associated methodologies that's clearly understood by all parties so that we know what the expectations are to get us to a level of compliance. They can't change weekly, monthly, yearly. Those methodologies need to be vetted out amongst the parties so that we all can agree on it, and then we know what the expectations are going into each paragraph.
Rodney, you're absolutely right. This is not a box ticking exercise. What we hope is that in the end, you'll have a culture in the Springfield Police Department that will be committed to continuous improvement and innovation.
Thank you. And the law and Tarrant team?
Thank you. We agree that this is an important process and one that's going to take some time. We also know that if these reforms are not meaningful, then what will have been the long process of the DOJ investigation and the consent decree if we can't get to meaningful reform issues? So part of that is figuring out, well, what is there, but also what isn't there. So for example, if you have a policy or practice where data, for example, might not be collected with respect to race or vehicle stops, whatever the issue may be, well, how are you going to know if there is a racial disparity, for example? That's an issue that came up in a different jurisdiction that we were working in. But it's so important to understand the jurisdiction and to work with the different stakeholders and investigate how the department, how the city, and how the community is working through these very important issues and looking at each of the requirements of the settlement agreement, not just as a matter of form, but really making sure, okay, we know we had a problem. How do we create the structures, the training, the oversight, all of the different issues that Mr. Tarrant and I are experts in to make sure that this whole process is meaningful and the community's voice is really heard. Perry?
The consent decree lists a number of areas and a number of boxes to be checked, but the boxes don't have voices. And what's important to this entire process, and I'll say it again, and you'll hear me repeat it several times, it's your voice that's important to this process. So part of that investigation, and believe me, from the experience I've had, both internally with police departments and with the community, there are going to be some uncomfortable conversations, but we will get to a point where we mutually agree on how to move forward. And that's how we start to build that plan. We build that plan, we execute it, and we move forward. Excuse me.
Thank you, Perry.
Thank you. The next question, which will be answered first by the O'Toole, Delgado, and Monroe team. Some of your team comes from a law enforcement background. In what ways do you think this would be a benefit in your role as a compliance evaluator? And in what ways do you think it will be a disadvantage?
Well, two of us have, I'm sorry, did you?
I messed up the order. Yeah. It should have been the law and Tarrant team should answer first. My apologies. You're on mute.
Oh, thank you. So there are strengths and weaknesses of having a law enforcement person or team come in and do this. I think if we look at the structure of our team, we get both perspectives. So Perry Tarrant, of course, is a very experienced law enforcement official. But it's really important that you understand how policing works and the different dynamics within policing culture and understanding procedures and practices. I am a lawyer, I've been a civil rights lawyer, I've been a prosecutor. And we bring different perspectives in making sure we're looking at the different issues through different lenses. And that's such an important piece, that we're not losing something, not out of bad faith, but that we're missing a perspective or overlooking something that perhaps if we weren't taking a critical eye from different perspectives might not be there. So we actually think it is a strength having Perry's strong police background, my litigation background, and work as a civil rights attorney and as a professor that I think would benefit the city of Springfield and its community.
And I just want to expound on that just a little bit. And again, with nearly 4 decades in law enforcement, virtually every operational assignment you can think of in law enforcement, I've done everything from working specialized units to investigations to canine to SWAT teams, all of that stuff. I've done all that operational stuff. So I believe that gives me a keen insight into how policing occurs. And I've had that experience at a variety of levels within a variety of different organizations. The second part of that question is, I can take the uniform off. What I can't take off is this. And so I don't see my background as having a law enforcement background as a disadvantage. What I see is the advantage I have of being able to see both sides of this issue.
And indeed, that's one of the reasons why Mr. Tarrant and I have teamed up for this project. I think, given the perspectives that we could offer the city of Springfield and its communities.
Thank you. And for the O'Toole, Delgado, and Monroe team?
Yeah, I would hope our reputations speak for themselves. In addition to the decades of policing that police experience that Rodney and I have, we've both been passionate advocates for human and civil rights, not only here in the US, but on the opposite side of the Atlantic as well. I worked on the peace process in Northern Ireland in that incredibly divided society and was a real champion for human rights in that process. So also as a lawyer, I'm a lawyer. I actually took the police job on a dare when I was in law school, thinking I'd be with it for just a year or two. And here I am 4 decades later. But, I learned to look at issues from every imaginable perspective, and actually worked on legislation in Massachusetts on civil rights legislation back in the 1980s with the AG's office and with prosecutors and defense attorneys. So I have a passion for justice, equitable justice, and I believe that Rodney and Natalia do as well. And that's why they're on this team. Natalia?
Yeah, my background has been as a prosecutor, and my background has been as the head of litigation for a police department. So I've been in various roles in law enforcement, but as I started with, I'm also a Puerto Rican woman who was raised in the city of Chicago. So part of why I do the work that I do is because I have been a directly impacted person. The passion comes from a true desire to see these processes improve for the whole world and for my specific communities as well. So this is more than just a labor of love. This is, the passion project for all of us. Rodney?
I think, when you look at Kathy and I background as it relates to law enforcement, we've not only served in a number of capacities within law enforcement agencies, but we've had the opportunity and the pleasure of leading those organizations. And I believe in each organization that we've been able to make a difference, to be able to move that organization further along and to move those organizations closer to the communities that we serve. And over the years, Kathy and I both, as well as Ms. Delgado, we've had the opportunity to assist in reforming police departments across.
I'm sorry, Mr. Monroe, that is time.
Thank you.
So for our next question, we will start with the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team to answer this question. What in your background and experience will reassure or convince the Springfield community that you will be an objective and fair voice in evaluating the issues that come before you as the compliance evaluator?
I believe that we have reputations as honest brokers. And I think it's really important for police to stand up, tell the truth, be transparent, particularly at times when things go awry. As the Boston Police Commissioner, I had to do that on a number of occasions. As the Seattle Police Chief and Secretary of Public Safety in Massachusetts, I had to do that on many occasions. So I think that transparency, and honesty, integrity, all those values that we bring to the table that we really feel passionate about, that we walk the talk. And I believe that our records speak for themselves, particularly during very difficult times. Rodney and Natalia?
I've had the opportunity to work with several police departments across the country in a number of projects. I currently serve as the deputy monitor for the Chicago Police Department consent decree. I've actually served as the lead monitor for the Meridian, Mississippi settlement agreement. And in each one of those assignments, I've had the opportunity to help bring people together. Not only are you just looking at the work of the organization, not only are you just getting input from the community, but you're broadening people's perspective to give them a much broader look at what law enforcement is about, what reform is about, and how to bring about change within the organization.
I think it's really, go ahead, I'm sorry, Natalia.
For me, in each of my roles, although they have been in law enforcement or public safety, they've been in really progressive positions where we've had the opportunity to look at things like wrongful convictions, or even what kinds of convictions we should no longer be prosecuting, and really make reforms to those offices in those substantial ways. So I think that my experience demonstrates being able to come at these traditional roles in progressive ways and implement new ideas.
Thank you. So same question now to the law Tarrant team.
Being objective and critical is such an important piece, not just of this project, but any project that I've worked on, particularly when I was a prosecutor. One of the most important things to do is make sure you're gathering the facts, weighing it properly, and applying them to objective standards and evidence, legal standards. Now, that said, objectivity can be something that's critiqued in different ways. In other words, is objectivity really objective if you don't believe folks who may come from a particular background, or you may not, given the different sort of implicit biases that we have? So my background, for example, as a federal public defender representing some of the poorest people, the most marginalized folks in this community, was an incredibly important experience in terms of shaping and understanding that we have voices, but we have to also understand what objectivity means. Of course, it's tied to facts, but also recognizing that it's such an important piece to make sure voices are heard and that we're not jumping to conclusions on what is and isn't credible.
Being able to bring a fair and objective voice to this process is pretty straightforward from my perspective. Having received the Walter Lamb Humanitarian Award for the work I've done historically as it relates to partnering communities and police to be more effective is just one of those things. But by and large, throughout my entire life as an adult, I've been focused in that particular area. From the very onset and early on in my law enforcement career, and to include when I was assigned to internal affairs. I've investigated cops. I've testified in court against cops. Since retiring in my current capacity, I've been called upon by both members of Congress, as well as the White House, as well as police chiefs, to come in and engage their communities and their departments. So you can fully expect me to be objective in my presentation and participation in this process.
Thank you. The next question is, in Springfield, citizens' complaints against officers seem to have not been credited, even when the same officer has 15 to 20 complaints about excessive force or abusive behavior. What has your experience been in making police departments truly accountable to the communities they serve? And we'll start with the law Terrence team.
So I've been working in this space regarding civilian complaints going back to the 1990s. And it's such an important piece to make sure that the investigations are effective and that you're reaching the right decisions based on the evidence. And that means making sure you're doing the thorough evidence. And it's looking structurally, is there a mechanism to actually receive the complaints? How does that work? What are the resources that departments or outside entities are putting toward actually looking at the complaints and figuring out, are we doing this properly? How is that process working? How is it supervised? All of these different pieces are such an important part when we talk about the investigative framework. But of course, also department leadership plays a huge role in this. Having the support of department leadership and ensuring that these complaints are taken seriously is a key piece. And certainly that's a part of the consent decree that we are going to take a close look at.
The Springfield Police Department should encourage citizens' complaints. Citizens' complaints from a police perspective or for an organizational perspective is a barometer of trust in your community. Now, having said that, I've had the opportunity to actually work with a number of communities, to start with the one I started my career in, in rewriting not only the procedures for how to accomplish that, but I've also worked with NACOL, which is an association of civilian oversight monitors and evaluators, to help frame a series of policies to include participating in writing their model policies on how to go about building a civilian oversight panel or council or committee. So again, and I'll just reiterate, the voice of the citizen in every community is absolutely important. The mechanisms to get those voices to the people who can make the changes, whether it's policy and operationally, has to be built out. And it has to be a valid process, and it has to be a trusted process. Thank you.
Thank you. The O'Toole, Delgado, and Monroe team.
Every complaint from the community should be investigated thoroughly, must be taken seriously, must be recorded, and feedback must be provided to members of the community that make complaints. But the complaint system in and of itself is only one piece of a larger accountability system. I believe in external independent oversight as well. I mean, and I was never intimidated by that as a police officer, as a police chief. In fact, I served in an oversight role as the inspector of a 16,000 member police service at one point. I did that for 6 years. So I too do not have any trouble holding police officers accountable, but I think that every single complaint has to be thoroughly investigated, and then officers need to be held accountable. Sometimes that requires discipline and firing, and I've had no trouble taking those actions as a police chief. But also, it's important to look at policies and training to ensure that we learn lessons from the complaints that we hear from the community. Rodney?
Kathy, a part of that process also includes citizen access to file a complaint. No citizen should have to file an affidavit. No citizen should only be able to file a complaint in person. They should have the ability to file complaints anonymously online. And one of the critical things, you talk about someone having 20 plus complaints, you have to have some type of a robust analysis associated with complaints so that you can see those patterns, you can see those practices, you can tweak your policy, you can tweak your training to make sure that you're addressing each and every citizen complaint fairly and equitably.
And accountability goes down the entire chain, right? It's not just holding the officer accountable, but the process has to be accountable. It has to be done in a timely fashion. The discipline has to be, close enough in time to the conduct. Those are the things that erode the public trust. So having objective standards that are clear, everyone understands, and are transparent so the public can understand what happened after the fact are the meaningful steps you really need to take to get trust.
Thank you. So for this question, we will start with the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team. One concern in Springfield is the lack of diversity in senior leadership at the police department. While the rank and file now more closely mirror the community, the leaders are from a different era, and many of them have significant IIU histories themselves. How will you work to change the culture at the police department when the people at the top do not appear committed to that change?
Well, first I'll say that a police service at every rank must reflect the community it serves in order to be credible, in order to earn trust. I felt very strongly about that. In Boston and in Seattle, my command staffs were more diverse than any time in history. I also think it's important to bring non-sworn, non-police people into command roles. In Seattle, I had the pleasure of working there with Perry Tarrant, who was on my team there. But we also brought in about 5 or 6 people who'd never worked in policing, who brought diversity of thought. we were diverse in every respect, not just in terms of race and gender, but in terms of lived experience and background. So I think that it's really important, and we would emphasize the importance of that throughout our work in Springfield. Rodney, Natalia?
Kathy, diversity just doesn't occur. Diversity only occurs when you're intentional about creating diversity within the organization. How are you identifying individuals and building a path for them towards greater leadership responsibilities? You just can't allow it to happen and wait for people to say, hey, I'm here. You have to go out, you have to find that talent, you have to develop that talent, and you have to bring that talent along by mentoring those individuals in order to move them up into the upper ranks. It won't happen by itself.
And morale requires a path to promotion. So to have, so many officers of color that I don't see a trajectory to promotion is problematic for discipline and morale. So those are things that have to be addressed head on, and again, transparently.
I agree that there's nothing more important than mentoring. I benefited hugely from some wonderful mentors in my career, and I think it's one of the most important roles a police leader plays.
Thank you. And the law and Terrace team?
Diversity is important. It's important that police organizations look like the communities they serve. And I don't think you'll get any disagreement on that principle. Now, effectuating that in practice can be harder. We see so many places where the actual workforces or the leadership just doesn't reflect our society. And policing is different. There's something acutely personal, indeed constitutional, where a police officer can potentially take a citizen's life. And we want the departments to reflect those communities and the values that they serve. And when that's missing, that tells us that that's an avenue that can be improved in order to ensure that, hey, we're part of the community. Police are part of the community and vice versa in an ideal situation. And it shouldn't be a top-down approach. It shouldn't be, we're telling you everything and how to do it, but rather this process, okay, we are part of your community as well. And diversity is an important piece of that.
When I started my career in Tucson with the Tucson Police Department, there was absolutely a lack of diversity. One of the things I did while I was there was wrote a comprehensive diversity recruiting and retention strategy. The heavier part of that was the retention. You're not going to keep good people in an organization if they don't see opportunity. I had the opportunity to testify in front of President Obama's 21st Century Task Force. My testimony specifically before that panel was on recruiting and retention. You don't see that among the six pillars. Maybe I was ahead of my time, but if you ask all those folks that were on that panel now, they will absolutely tell you that that was something that should have been addressed and should have been pillar number 7. You can't build an organization without including diversity. And that's not just BIPOC or people of color, but that also includes gender as well. What happens when you limit diversity is you limit and narrow the thought processes. You eliminate and or miss community perspectives. So there's an opportunity as it relates to building out a strategy to build diversity into the leadership of the organization.
Thank you. What steps will be taken in order to ensure buy-in from the then Narcotics Bureau and now Firearm Investigations Unit officers, supervisors, and commanders on changes in protocol? And how will a potential lack of buy-in be addressed? And the Law and Terrence team will answer this question. And just so that it's clear, the Department of Justice investigation was originally focused on the Narcotics Bureau, the Narcotics Unit. That unit has since been changed to the Firearms Investigations Unit.
You can write as many policies as you want, but they really don't mean anything if they're not enforced and if there isn't buy-in from the folks who will enforce those policies. And whether that's sergeants in the particular department, lieutenants, and on up, that's such an important piece. What systems are in place to ensure that the policies meant to rectify what's happened before with respect to excessive force are meaningful? And that is going to require monitoring. That's such an important piece of what we view this project as being. Let's get on the ground. Let's figure out how we can actualize the changes that have to be made in Springfield so that there is accountability, not just in terms of the policies, which are important, but that the policies translate into 21st century policing principles, and that ultimately these changes are institutionalized and effective.
From my perspective, the buy-in comes from understanding the rules, understanding the parameters of operation, and by the way, the accountability piece. The heavier part of that is on the accountability piece. First and foremost, having worked in a number of specialized units, I understand the tactics behind that. You have to hold people accountable for their tactics as opposed to their results. You've heard this saying, what gets measured gets done. It's more about measuring those interactions with your community than it is about the stats. The stats aren't nearly as important as the relationships that are destroyed from not having effective community relationships and not having a unit that understands the value of the community that they're serving, and more importantly, not grasping their larger role as it relates to public safety. And the last piece of that is the monitoring aspect of it. Again, having a background in tactics, having a background in having worked specialized units, I get the camaraderie there. I get sometimes you have to break that up. The risk to the unit if they're not successful, if they're not on board, the unit can be easily dissolved. But the goal is not to dissolve or to discourage the unit, but make them more effective in what you're trying to accomplish within the community. Thank you.
Thank you. And the O'Toole, Monroe, and Delgado team?
Just as we emphasize the importance of engaging with the community authentically, we also need to engage with the police. We need to listen closely to their perspectives. I've always found as a chief, I spend as much time as roll calls as possible. I do ride-alongs with police officers. I really need to hear their perspectives. They're the ones out there on the front lines every day. So whether they're in a specialized unit or whether they're in a patrol car day in and day out, we need to hear their perspectives too. We need to respect their role, their stakeholders as well. When I was Secretary of Public Safety, and just before that, I oversaw the consolidation of the 4 state police entities in Massachusetts. I went to every single police station, every single state police barracks, rolled up my sleeves, went into the room and said, I just left my rank at the door. I want to hear honestly, I want to hear your perspectives. And those perspectives were really helpful in informing my work. And the good police really appreciated that they had a voice in the process. When I was in Seattle, I used to go to union meetings all the time, stand in front of the crowd, even at the most contentious times, and say, you know, ask the questions. I just want to be I want to be honest with you. I want to engage with you. I think somebody alluded to this. You can't dictate change. People have to buy in. Now, you have to hold them accountable. But at the same time, if you can engage with them authentically and they buy into the change, there's a much better chance of success. I know that, Rodney, you've certainly practiced this model as well.
You know, there's a couple of different levels. One is, you know, the selection process. I think you have to be very thorough in that process of selecting individuals to those specialized units. Not necessarily is it always the one that has the most arrests, the most guns recovered and so forth. And then you have to better define the problem. And not only once you define the problem, but how do you look at all elements associated with that problem? And it's not always just about enforcement. A lot of times creating community buy-in, community support, looking at different situations within a community can help you address that problem just as well as the enforcement aspects as well, and supervision.
We ended right on time. Thank you.
Thank you. So our next question will go first to the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team. What groups do you intend on engaging with during these 4 years? And what role will the criminal defense bar play, if any?
I think it's really important to engage with everybody who wants a voice in this process. Every group, every individual will have group meetings, individual meetings, in-person meetings, online meetings. We'll do surveys. We'll welcome people's input electronically. We need to create as many opportunities as possible for people to contribute to this process. I think that's incredibly important. And we'll roll up our sleeves and we'll be there. We'll be present in Springfield so that anybody who wants to have a voice in the process will have that. I've worked very closely with the defense bar. I mean, I worked with the Innocence Project. I had to stand up and apologize when I was Boston Police Commissioner to people who had been wrongfully convicted decades prior to my service there, and worked very closely to put new policies and procedures in place to ensure that those atrocities didn't happen again. So I think it's really important. I've worked with the ACLU, I've worked with the NAACP, I've worked with the Urban League. I mean, I really appreciate how those groups and so many others have come to the table and engaged with us so that everybody benefits, particularly the community. Natalia, you have some strong thoughts about all of this.
Yeah, it's hard to not say everyone, but it's hard to list people and not leave anyone out. So, you know, I think that we are sincere about wanting to engage everyone who wants to be engaged in this process, including young people, and again, directly impacted people. So survivors, I think, are extremely important part of all of this. So everyone who wants to be with us. Rodney?
I think you have to be intentional about going out and reaching those that have lived experiences, that's had a tough time dealing with the police. They may not readily come to us, but organizations like the Defense Bar and others that can do outreach to help bring those individuals to us, you have to seek them out as well.
Thank you. The Law and Tarrant team.
You have to have robust outreach, as we've touched on earlier. If you're not getting an appropriate cross-section of folks impacted, then what does your outreach really mean? And when we talk about all of these different entities, as we just heard, well, the Defense Bar has to be part of that. When we think about how force can work, well, if there is a use of force, there often is an arrest that follows from that. And defense attorneys can be an important source of information about things that, whether it's a public defender's office or the private defense bar, about things that they are seeing on the ground that might not be captured by some of these other groups because of the access to the indigent population or the folks who are potentially on the receiving end of uses of force. When we talk about outreach generally, of course, we're talking about everybody from the police unions to the defense bar to nonprofits, community groups, faith groups. It's a very broad group. And again, can't name everybody, but it's such an important piece. And to address specifically the question about the defense bar, that's an important component of our outreach plan.
And I'll just follow Andrew up by saying that you have to include everybody. It's absolutely important. I will say that I've never turned down an invitation to speak to any group at any time in any community that I've ever been to. And the reason why is that's how you begin to build relationships. That's how you begin to build trust. One of my very first assignments as a young police officer was I was assigned to a neighborhood that the primary language there was Spanish. I spoke French in high school in Canada, so I learned Spanish to be able to communicate with the neighborhood that I was working in. So there is that desire to be inclusive and to engage everyone. The second part of that is I've worked a number of different issues, everything from having worked with the Innocence Project to working with the ACLU as it relates to doing review of investigations that ultimately led to the release of a young man that had been in prison for about 30 years, wrongfully convicted. Contemporarily, I'm working with MIT and MIT Solve with a group of defense attorneys on the West Coast to come up with a technology solution to look at how better to address not only folks who are in probation or on probation, but to further divert them in the first place at that first point of contact with the
That
police.
is time, Mr. Terry.
Thank you.
The next question has a couple of parts. Hiring, promotions, and discipline of officers are all of concern. Widely publicized and recorded incidents of serious police misconduct have not resulted in officers being fired. For example, an illegal and horrifying interrogation of a juvenile by an officer did not result in his discharge. In another instance, an officer was recorded assaulting a student and he was not fired. How do you intend to insist that officers are held accountable for their behaviors? And again, we'll start with the law and Terrence.
Accountability is such an important piece of this project. And it's something that I've seen where it's failed. There were criminal cases that we were investigating and or prosecuting. And one of the potential subjects would resign from the force, evade internal discipline, and get picked up by another department. So there's that question of getting discipline imposed properly, but also promptly, and making sure that when there is a finding, there's something broken with the process, most likely. What is happening at the investigative level? What is happening with the policies to ensure that the investigations are done appropriately? And who's reviewing the outcomes of these investigations? All of those are critical components in making sure that if you have these serious allegations of use of force, that they're being investigated thoroughly and correctly, and also being reviewed in that manner. Period.
The first part of that is you start with who you hire. You start with the why. Why do they want to join your department? Why do they want to work in your community? Why do they want to work in your city? Why do they want to work with you? That's the first part. That's where you start. It's not a job. It is a very difficult industry to work in. And so you have to start with that why. And when you bring folks in and make them part of the organization. The second part of that is that you have to properly train. Once you get past that aspect of it, is you have to hold people accountable from the very beginning. And I'm not talking about the folks who are misbehaving or engaging in wrongful and unprofessional conduct or criminal conduct. I'm talking about the folks who investigate that behavior. You have to investigate that accurately, objectively, and more importantly, with facts that you can hold accountable. And then the last piece of that is the process as it relates to discipline, bargaining, collective bargaining agreements, and those aspects as well. And so the last part of that is that nobody wants a bad cop in their department. Nobody wants to work alongside of a bad cop. And then the last piece of that is that getting to that point of agreement with the labor organizations to where everyone agrees on a process to get folks out of your city.
Thank you. And the O'Toole, Monroe, and Delgado team?
I would agree that it's very important to have robust hiring standards in place. And, I think that we do a terrible job in policing of telling our own story. Sometimes we attract people who believe that policing is all about law enforcement, and they watch television and think it's gunfights and car chases, when in fact, most police work is providing service to vulnerable people. So I think if we do a better job of telling our story during the recruitment process, we'll attract a much more desirable candidate pool. And then, of course, with promotions, I don't believe that a written test alone is an indication of somebody's ability to do a job. A written test doesn't test for values. I want people with integrity, people who have great leadership skills. So I think the promotion process has to be carefully evaluated. And finally, discipline. Absolutely. We need to hold police officers accountable. I used to agonize when I used to have to fire a police officer because I thought about that person's livelihood. I thought about the person's family, but I also had to take into consideration the community's interests and the department's interests. Inevitably, every time I've fired a police officer, I got feedback from decent police saying, you know, Chief, that should have happened a long time ago. So I know Natalia's done a lot of work in this area on accountability and discipline. So I'd ask her to weigh in on this too, please.
Well, I just briefly to something we touched upon earlier, transparency in the process. The question alluded to specific examples of things that have occurred that have eroded the public's trust. So the public's need to understand the disciplinary process and why outcomes are the way they are, and not simply be uninformed about why someone is still on the job, you know, whether it's the prosecutor couldn't prove the charges or whatever it is, making sure that there is clear transparency in the process so that the community can have confidence in that process. Rodney?
I think Natalia said it very well, and I don't want to get caught on that time again. But again, it's about accountability. It's about making sure that you have the right systems in place, that you can detect those things early and not until they pile themselves up one after other.
Perfect timing with 3 seconds to go.
Thank you.
In light of the additional, in light of the speed in which we went through the 9 questions we planned to ask, we will choose 2 additional questions from those that were submitted by the community. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer to ask the next question. Actually, you know what? I can ask it. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jennifer. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. Sorry, everyone. Since we had our 9 questions, we're just sort of working behind the scenes here. But this question will be for the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team. How do you achieve the reforms necessary for successful resolution of the consent decree?
I think it's really important to have a roadmap, and so that everybody knows exactly what the expectations are up front. I know that some consent decrees that I've been involved in have become frustrating processes because monitoring teams have the bar has changed. You know, in other words, the target is moving. We've heard monitors say, well, I'll know it when I see it. And I think it's really important to establish the roadmap right up front, working with the parties to set the expectations, to let people know what measurements will be used in order to determine whether compliance has been achieved or not. So this will require not only analyzing lots of data, and when I say data, not just numbers, not just quantitative data, but qualitative data as well. You know, our engagement with the community, what we're hearing is feedback from the community, what we're hearing, the feedback from officers and people within the organization. So I think that it's going to be, again, I think it has to be a very transparent process so everybody knows exactly what's expected. They know exactly what metrics are going to be used in advance so that there are no surprises along the way. Rodney, you've done a lot of work on consent decrees, and so you can speak to this process as well.
I don't think it should ever be all or nothing. I think that, you know, in order to come into full compliance, you have to have steps. And at each step, you have to have the methodologies clearly decided upon upfront on what is it going to take to get to preliminary compliance. And preliminary compliance may just be policy development. How did you go about developing policy? The next level may be secondary compliance training. What type of training have you employed? And then ultimately, to get the full and effective compliance, you have to see things over a much longer period of time and be able to assess those. But even those still have metrics associated with that, so you know what you're looking for and what to expect.
Leave it there.
The law and Terrence.
Clarity and having clear guidelines is so important because otherwise, what are you measuring performance by? What does success look like? What does substantial and effective compliance look like? And there are examples historically of where the monitoring process kind of takes on a life of its own. There are jurisdictions that have been under these agreements for a very, very, very long time. The goal, of course, is to get the department into substantial and effective compliance within the terms as outlined in the settlement agreement. But that can be a challenging process. In other words, it's not a clear line from point A to point B all the time. Sometimes there are steps back. Sometimes there are moments to adjust and adapt. And that will be, to a certain extent, iterative as we work through the challenges that will be there. Communicating with all the stakeholders is such an important part of making sure that this process works the best that it can. But understanding this is not easy. And we come into this understanding that this is challenging. Perry, you've done a lot of compliance DOJ consent decree work, so I'll turn it over to you.
A part of my background and extensively, I've written plans for operations, strategic plans to move organizations forward. With this particular settlement agreement, we will have a plan. Achieving compliance, full and effective compliance has to be articulated upfront so we know what the goal line is. It's not about moving the goal line. It's not trying to define the goal line and building it while we're flying it. It is upfront transparency on what we want to achieve. The second part of that is compliance isn't just when the evaluator says we've hit compliance. Compliance is when there's consensus that we've achieved it. So that means consensus from the perspective of you, the community, consensus from the perspective of the police department, the city, and Department of Justice as well. And so, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And the last question that will be asked this evening to both teams. What is your experience working with Black, Brown, and people of color in the past 10 years? Please list 2 groups with which you have worked. The law and Tarrant group will go first.
So in the roles that I've had in government, a key part of what I had to do was engage with different communities, sometimes with groups and families who lost loved ones to police violence as part of our outreach to work on improving the process for investigating uses of force and to trying to come up with a better procedure for ensuring that these things are done timely and appropriately. When I was a deputy city attorney in Oakland, I created a unit that addresses what's called affirmative litigation. In other words, it's bringing lawsuits that are civil rights related. And when I was talking to the city attorney in Oakland, what do you want to call it? It's the community lawyering and civil rights unit, that there is this tie to stakeholder outreach to understand what the issues are in a particular place. And place matters. So when we talk about outreach, particularly in the type of work that I've done, where there are significant racial disparities in how some of these issues work in our society, if you're not having those conversations, it comes back to, well, what outreach are you really doing to begin with? So I've always tried to make that a key piece, part of the work that I have done in government, working with everything from nonprofits to impacted families and other groups.
For me, it would be shorter to list the groups I haven't worked with. I've worked with a variety of different community groups across the country, starting with the communities that I lived in and grew up in, the communities I went to school with. But in the last 10 years specifically, I've worked with the Black community in Ferguson, Missouri, shortly after Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed in that community. The mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, reached out to the Obama White House and asked for a team to respond there. I was chosen to lead that blue ribbon team into that community, to work with that community following the death of Keith Lamont Scott. I've worked with the NAACP. I've worked with the ACLU. I was a member of the Asian Directors the Agent Directors Committee in the city of Seattle in Chinatown. I've worked with a variety of different communities. I worked with.
Sorry, Mr. Tarrant, that's time.
All right, thanks.
And now to the O'Toole, Delgado Monroe team.
Well, like the other team, we could certainly list all of the organizations we've engaged with, all of the major national organizations, but I really like to go into particularly the traditionally underserved neighborhoods in a community and get to know the local groups, because I think each community has its unique characteristics, and it's important to listen to local people on the ground. I've found the clergy to be incredibly helpful. I mean, working closely with the clergy on gang violence in Boston, we were able to reduce the number of homicides dramatically, and many young people's lives were saved as a result. Working out in Seattle, constantly engaged with the clergy there, particularly the Black clergy there, and they're just such wonderful human beings who are honest brokers and really helped us build bridges to the community. And during the most difficult times, you know, I knew I could trust those people, and they knew they could trust me as well. So I think that while it's great to have the affiliation and the experience with the national organizations, it's really important to get to know the local representatives in a community.
You're absolutely right, Kathy. Those with that lived experience, those within those neighborhoods, those that don't often have the opportunity for their voices to be heard, how do you seek them out and identify what their needs and concerns are and develop relationships with them, not just listen, but develop a relationship with them?
Beyond the clergy, there are so many community groups that are providing services and have safe places where they already have community occurring. So figuring out where those places are and how we engage with those people so that we have the most meaningful relationships that we need to, again, make the work progress.
Thank you to both teams. That concludes the questions for this portion of the meeting. So thank you again. I know we threw a couple more questions at you than we said we would. We also asked, you know, we hadn't shown you or told you about these questions in advance. We also gave you very tight timelines. So thank you to both teams for your thoughtful and succinct answers. Now we're going to move to the closing remarks portion. Each team will have 5 minutes to give their closing remarks. And since the O'Toole, Monroe, Delgado team went first for intros, we will have the Law Tarrant team start with their closing remarks.
Thank you for participating in this process. Your voice is important. That's where I started, and that's where I will continue to be, is your voice is important. The bulk of my experience, whether the communities I've lived in, and I've relocated to every community that I've worked in, and every community that I've responded to, the first thing I've always done and will continue to do is listen to the voices. When I first got to Ferguson, Missouri, shortly after Michael Brown Jr. was shot and killed, I didn't spend a lot of time dealing with the protests. I didn't spend a lot of time with the most vocal. I spent the bulk of my time on porches, knocking on doors, talking to the folks who were most affected by what was transpiring in their neighborhood. You can expect the same from me as well. We can have meetings. We can invite you to come see us. I will come see you. That's where the community building starts. That's where the relationship starts. And that's where we will be most effective. We're looking forward for the opportunity to work with you. I think we're going to be very effective at moving your community through the settlement agreement at a quick pace with real results that are sustainable. And then the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Andrew is, again, your voice matters. You are a partner in accomplishing this, and you can expect to be at the table from the start to the finish with us. Andrew.
Thank you, Perry. And I would just point out that we recognize the gravity of the work that is potentially ahead of us. We understand how hard it is and how far-reaching the impacts can be when your voice has not been heard for a very long time. And outreach is such an important piece of what we will do. Perry is a nationally recognized expert in leading outreach efforts, and we have gone through the settlement agreement, and we have a plan for executing each one of those and have timelines and how we would go about doing that work. So we are being very intentional in terms of how we are approaching this project. We are a very collaborative team. We work very closely together, and I think we bring very important strengths that collectively we can help Springfield reach substantial and effective compliance. We thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm humbled to be here. And it is really just so important that we recognize up front this is not going to be a short-term solution. In other words, this is not going to be done in 3 months. That this is going to be a lot of hard work. We're going to be rolling up our sleeves, and we're going to be out and about within the community and talking to all the different stakeholders within the city, within the police department, within the Justice Department, and all of the other voices that are important in this process. We thank you for your time and attention, and we hope to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from the O'Toole Monroe Delgado team.
Great. I'd like to start by asking Natalia to share some of her thoughts.
That was a surprise. I think, again, I want to start by just saying that for us, doing this work is a privilege. We're here doing this because we believe in justice, and we believe that the experience that we've accumulated between the three of us is the good, strong foundation for achieving substantial compliance here of the settlement agreement and consent decree. We're committed to achieving sustainable results here. This is not about, again, short-term solutions. This is about changing culture, and to do so takes a tremendous amount of work that we're committed and happy and earnest about doing. So certainly this is weird in that I don't get to see any of the community asking these questions, but we welcome the opportunity to engage face-to-face and hear from you personally about how this is impacting you and how we best can serve as the compliance monitors in your estimation. So again, for me, this is really an opportunity and a privilege, and I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to continuing to engage with this community.
Rodney?
We're going to save Kathy for last. You know, one of the things, I've been in law enforcement for 40 years, and law enforcement should not be looked upon as a closed shop, a closed fraternity. When you look at law enforcement, you know, there's nothing secret about what it is that we do. Yes, there may be a few confidential investigations that we may be involved in, but for the overall purpose, law enforcement should be opened up to the community, because that's who we're serving. Whether it's policy, whether it's training, whether it's promotion, the community should have a role in each one of those critical elements, because everything that you do associated with policy, training, promotion ultimately affects the community. And with that, I believe the community needs to be involved to greater lengths. Kathy?
Thank you, Rodney. I'd just like to say what a pleasure it's been to participate in this conversation tonight. What great questions, really thought-provoking. So I learned a lot tonight as well. I think our track record speaks for itself. I'm on the monitoring team in Baltimore. I was on the monitoring team in Chicago. As the monitor of a federal consent decree, I led an organization in East Haven, Connecticut to full and effective compliance. As the chief out in Seattle, I led that organization to full and effective compliance with the requirements of the consent decree during the period of time that I was chief. So I think that our track record speaks for itself. But we bring passion to this work. I mean, we're sincere people who really care about these outcomes. And as a native of Western Massachusetts and a lifelong Massachusetts resident, I just feel it would be an incredible privilege to give back to take some of that experience that I've had over the years and to bring that to Springfield. It's a wonderful community. I hope we do have the opportunity to engage with you face to face. And I promise you that, you know, we'll roll up our sleeves and listen to everybody's voices in the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both teams for answering the questions and for providing those helpful closing remarks. As I stated earlier, the Department of Justice sent out the registration information and asked for questions to be submitted by July 18th. For the Department of Justice received over 20 questions, and tonight we picked 11 of those questions to ask the teams. We started off with selecting 5 questions, and then the Department of Justice in the city increased it to 9. And as we looked at the clock this evening and during the event, we added 2 more questions. For the remaining questions that were not asked during this event, but that were submitted by the deadline to the Department of Justice, those questions will be posted online at the Department of Justice website. And the teams will be asked to answer those questions by the end of day on Sunday, July 24th. Again, those questions that were submitted by the deadline will be posted online, and the teams will answer those questions by Sunday, July 24th, which is this coming Sunday. In addition to that, the Department of Justice is allowing feedback to be submitted by members of the community following this event up until July 25th. So if members of the community have any additional comments, they can certainly, submit that feedback to the Department of Justice at the website that is on your screen, and at the website, at the email address that is on your screen. Again, keep in mind that the time period to submit questions has come and gone, but if you want to submit additional feedback after you've heard both teams speak this evening, you can do so up until Monday, July 25th. Tonight's meeting, a recording of tonight's meeting will be available on YouTube in both English and Spanish, as well as on channel 17, which is the local cable access channel. When it's available, you can watch it on demand on focusspringfield.com /compliance-evaluators. And that is the web address that's at the bottom of your screen. I want to take a moment to thank all the, the team for applying, for showing their interest in this very important exercise for the city of Springfield, as well as Focus Springfield for handling all of the Zoom meeting and logistics for this evening. I'd also like to thank the City Law Department personnel, as well as the Department of Justice attorneys and personnel who have all worked tirelessly over the last few years, and especially the last few hours, to host this event. And last but not least, I want to thank the community, not only for attending this event, but also for submitting important questions and raising issues and concerns that you would like to see addressed by both teams. That is it, and thank you very much for taking the time to attend tonight's event.